Thanks for joining me for another episode of the Your Longevity Blueprint podcast. Today, my guest is Thomas Pennel, who's an account executive who has worked in the supplement and nutrition space for a company called Ortho Molecular Products. After receiving a degree in integrated biology from the University of Illinois, a little health scare with his now fiance gave him his first interaction with functional medicine. After seeing firsthand how functional medicine impacted her life, this drove him to seek out professional nutrition companies for the opportunity to work with providers and help shape patient care. He has worked with over 1,000 clinics across the Midwest, including ours, which has included a wide array of practitioners, clinics, and pharmacies. He's previously worked with practices across Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, and Pennsylvania, and now resides in Iowa, where he currently works with over 400 active practices. He uses this experience to help providers consult and bring functional medicine to their patients with a strong focus on improving clinical outcomes. Welcome to the show, Thomas.
Well, thank you, Dr. Gray. I appreciate it. I've been a big fan for a while, at least as long as I've been here. So it's pretty cool to actually talk.
I'm excited to have you on the show. I know you're going to woo and awe our listeners. So
thank you.
As the audience may or may not remember, I had another Tom Poole, early on the show, episodes 6 and 7, where we discussed supplement myths. And I highly encourage followers go back and listen to those episodes if these topics interest you. But I think today we're going to expand and get this other Tom, or Thomas, I should say, opinion on similar topics. So again, to remind my listeners, chapter 4 of my book, Your Longevity Blueprint, discusses how important nutrients are for our body. And today we're going to talk about nutrients. So nutrients are involved in a wide variety of chemical reactions in your body. Basically, nutrients come from food and they can come from supplementation. So just to walk listeners through right digestion, as food is digested, nutrients are transported through the body to assist in all types of metabolic processes that happen in our cells and that are absolutely necessary for life. In my analogy in my book, I share how nutrients transporting themselves through your body are a little like moving through the rooms in a house in which each room has a door that's locked. In order to move from room to room, you have to have the right key to unlock that door. The same is true with our body. Every cell in our body has a receptor site that receptors bind to, kind of like a key fitting in a keyhole. For that receptor to bind correctly to unlock that door, your body requires all the micronutrients I mentioned in chapter 4, and these are what we're going to talk about today. So when our cells don't get what they need, the body doesn't work right, and something, or many somethings bad can happen, right? Like you get brain fog, fatigue, and eventually chronic disease. So we used to be able to get a lot of these nutrients from our foods, right? My grandparents always were farmers. They had a lot of home cooked meals, right? They didn't take a lot of supplements back then, but I think times have changed. So I want to kind of open this interview asking you, Thomas, why do you think our food sources are now more deficient and we need supplementation? I know that's a loaded question, but let's start with why are food sources more deficient now?
Yeah, why we need supplementation is a loaded question. But you're incredibly lucky, first off, to have grown up in a space where your grandparents grew their own food and you were able to eat and cook that, right? Because I talk a lot about nutritional deficiencies, and I didn't grow up in an environment where that was really the thing. Actually, in my parents' backyard, I built a little raised bed garden where they could start growing their own food, which is awesome. My mom has totally adopted that and just kind of ran with it. But I didn't grow up with that, right? I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago. So the food that we got was whatever's coming from the grocery store. So first off, you were incredibly lucky, right? But even so, if you compare the food that, for instance, your grandparents ate when they were kids compared to what you ate when you were a kid, right? Even then, we're talking about nutritional deficiencies because the either soil depletion, so the minerals that are available in that soil, right, are no longer there. Because every time that we grow food, that food, think like a carrot, right? Or even corn or whatever it is, right? Those things absorb minerals and vitamins and nutrients from the soil. When it goes into that and we consume that, we're able to use that. But each time we do that, and we live in Iowa, right? So there's farms everywhere. But each time that we do that, we deplete that soil just a little bit further, right? And in addition to that, population's not getting any healthier, right? We talk about patients all the time as it relates to digestion, especially gut health. And our ability, as you talked about earlier, unlocking those keys, our ability to break down that food, break down those nutrients, and eventually absorb them is limited. So if our gut has high inflammation, if we have chronic disease in our gut, if we're having issues with intestinal permeability, where I'm basically saying we're absorbing a lot of things we're not supposed to, right? We're going to create an environment where maybe we're not absorbing those same minerals. So even if the soil is, as good as it possibly could be, if we're repleting the soil and we're growing in our backyard and we're doing all those wonderful things, maybe now we're not as healthy as we quite used to be, right? So maybe we're not absorbing things as well as we could. So it's basically a double-edged sword where, gut health isn't getting any better and the soil isn't getting any better either.
Good answer. I had both of those points written down in my notes, the deficient soil and then also poor gut health. What about, I talk a lot about stress on the podcast. How do you feel about stress?
All the time. Now, stress, obviously, I mean, stress can be a few different things, right? So it can be cellular stress, it can be environmental stress, it can be mental, emotional stress, right? Stresses on our body can basically push us a direction where we can end up with chronic disease, right? Or if we talk about specifically adrenal health, can leave us in an environment where we're talking about low energy, low mood, talking about fatigue, chronic fatigue, brain fog. Stress it's a killer. It's a silent killer, right? Because we talk about people as it relates to, COVID-19 pandemic and trying to figure out what's going on with, work and life and getting kids on Zoom calls for classes and things like that. It's a very stressful environment, right? So stress in our bodies is paramount, that we manage that and are able to effectively mitigate that to the best of our abilities.
And I want to come back to adrenal health, maybe at the end of the show, because I do want to talk about adrenals, but
Sure.
stress requires more nutrients, right? So
Right.
when we live in this stressed lifestyle, when we have that stressed lifestyle, we need more nutrients. What about, I want to make sure we cover like medications causing nutritional deficiencies. Do
Oh,
you
yeah.
want to expand on
Yep.
that a little bit?
Yeah, so we call that in the industry, we call that drug-induced nutrient depletion, right? So we know, you and I both know, that the amount of prescription medications, and it's not only availability, so right, more drugs are entering the market now than they were 50, 60, 70, 100 years ago, right? Which is awesome. It's obviously helped a lot of people's lives as it relates to, patients who genuinely need medication. It's a great thing, right? Antibiotics have saved lives. There's specific medications that have saved lives, but we now live in an environment where more people are on medications that maybe could have been mitigated by lifestyle choices, right? So talking about actually, seeking out functional integrative care and talking about actually using supplementation and using lifestyle modifications to avoid that. But when we take a lot of these medications, so if we think about things like metformin, right? Metformin is able to block the absorption of B vitamins, and B vitamins are used everywhere for neurotransmitter production. They're used for energy production, right? As we talk about stress. We talk about CoQ10 as it relates to statin prescriptions. Patient on statins, it basically blocks our body's ability to produce its own CoQ10, which long term, I should say, can be kind of insidious. It's not a good thing. I mean, there's 100 different medications we could talk about, but my point is that prescription medications, almost pretty much in any form, disrupt some sort of pathway. That's their goal, right? We talk about different medications, it's to disrupt some sort of pathway in order to achieve an outcome. And when we do that, sometimes we get these secondary effects where we're depleting specific nutrients, either through absorption or our body's ability to either use them, create them, or make them. Absolutely. It's huge.
So medications are another variable there.
Yeah.
But if you're taking a medication, that's okay. There's hope, right? You can take the nutrient that the medication is depleting you of. And at our clinic, we run a fancy nutritional analysis where we can literally, and I've talked about this before on the show, where we can look for vitamins, minerals, amino acids,
awesome.
antioxidants,
Awesome.
Deficient in the body, and then replace them. So the good news is we can replace them. There are supplements we can take, right? But consumers, I think, many times can be fooled by marketing. They see a commercial and then they think, okay, I need to go take krill oil. So they go to Walmart and they buy, buy an inferior product. So I really want to talk about what makes a good supplement company and kind of how consumers can decide which companies are making high quality products. So let's start with what you believe makes a good supplement company.
Yeah. So that's a big question, right? Because if I think about it from a consumer's perspective, and I know a lot of people who listen to your podcast are consumers of dietary supplements and consumers of this type of education, that market is so watered down now, right? It seems like, especially because of COVID, people are more invested in their own personal health than they ever have been, which is a great thing, right? Continue to do that. Yeah. But as a result, you see, money kind of follows where the demand is. So people have a demand for dietary supplements, and they have a demand for specific nutrients in this type of healthcare. Now you see supplement companies popping up left and right that didn't exist, right? Or even if you rewind the clock before COVID, there's still a lot of that going on, right? So what I'm ultimately talking about is I'm talking about the difference between essentially what we call the professional channel and the retail channel. Right. So the professional channel is kind of where we operate. So where Ortho Molecular Products operates. And we work exclusively with licensed healthcare providers like yourself, right? Because we know that you guys are actually out here transforming the practice of medicine, which I'm sure you've heard quite a few different times, right? Actually improving patient outcomes, running those labs, running those micronutrient panels, and sitting down and saying, hey, how can we address these deficiencies in order for you to live a longer, healthier life, right? Compare that to the retail channel, however, I think this, is a pretty easy path to follow. There's a lot of companies who just want to make money, right? If you go down Walmart, Costco, I was just in Costco the other day and they have a huge section. It's absolutely massive, right?
The vitamins, right as you walk in,
yeah.
right as you enter, it's like, yeah.
Yeah. And as you're checking out too, it's on both sides, right?
Which is good marketing. I mean, it's
Absolutely.
good
Absolutely.
marketing.
You hit the nail on the head, marketing, right? Because these companies, they're not invested in, if you look at their, their mission and kind of what they're trying to do, they're not really invested in patient healthcare. What they want to do is they want to offer patients options. They want that shelf space, right? So if you think about retail products as they exist in the market, what are basically, and I'm sure you've heard Tom say this before, but what are basically the two ways that we can change the cost of a dietary supplement? There's two ways we can do it. We can lower the quality of that raw material, right? So the company is buying cheaper raw materials, or we can lower the amount of that raw material that's in that product, right? Because 1 gram of something costs less than 5 grams of something, right? It's just how it works. So if you think about it from a patient's perspective, these companies that exist more in the retail space, I'm talking about anything that's available in big box stores, online, Amazon, eBay, whatever it is. A lot of these companies, what they are is they're owned by corporate shareholders. They're owned by people who are executives who want to make money, because that's why their shareholders are invested in those companies, right? So their goal is to ultimately, like I said, make money. They're not really invested in patient outcomes. They're not invested in clinical outcomes. So what they're doing is they're doing those two things I talked about before, where they're lowering the cost of the raw material by getting something that's inferior, right? Or they're lowering how much is actually in that product. So now it's an inferior raw material, inferior product, not having as much as they should, right? So it's subtherapeutic dosing. It's not doing as much as it should for your patients. So if you look at it from a patient's perspective, and it's kind of hard to see, because if you look at it, it's all marketing, right? These labels are very flashy, fancy, they've got these big signs, buy one, get one free, whatever it is, right? It's very hard to sift through that. And I totally understand that. So my advice, and I'll kind of dig into more specifics, but my advice would be—
please do. Yeah.
Yeah.
This is good. You keep going. Yeah.
Yeah. My advice would be to kind of seek out an integrative or functional provider in your area, or if you can, work with Dr. Gray, right? Because, that's ultimately where you're going to see practitioners who have spent the time to seek out high quality companies like ourselves, or have specific training, who are actually trained on these supplements or trained on these nutrients to actually run a panel. Right. So talking about micronutrient deficiencies, or run further blood work to actually evaluate what your specific micronutrient needs are. It's very confusing, right? We go online, if you type in CoQ10 in Amazon, there's 100 different products that will show up, and not all of those products are created equal. Not all supplements are created equal, right? Which talks about with Tom. So that's I can get more specific with it, but that's kind of my big advice, is just seek out someone, in your area who's very well versed in that. And there are practitioners. Yeah.
I totally agree. Good answer. Let's go back to kind of the two ways you were saying other, brands can lower their costs. So one is to essentially not put the therapeutic dose of that, raw material or whatever ingredient in the product. And that's something that we certainly pride ourselves on, is making sure that everything that's on the shelf, that we're selling to patients is of therapeutic potency. So can you talk a little bit about, I know Ortho Molecular has kind of 3 major points with their products that they source high quality ingredients. Let's go there and let's talk about the therapeutic potency. And then there's a third point too.
Yeah. So one of those points is the therapeutic dosing, so if you look at Ortho, what we call ourselves, which is absolutely, nail on the head, is we are an evidence-based natural solutions company. And what I mean by that is that every formulation that we come out with, for every raw material that we use, every specific reason that we have 60 milligrams, 100 milligrams, 200 milligrams of something in a product, is because there's a study that's associated with that raw material for improving patient outcomes, right? I call that window dressing. We call that window dressing, when a company will have kind of the main components, but maybe they're just putting like icing on a cake, right? Or sprinkles, or whatever you want to think about. I know we're not eating a ton of that stuff, Dr. Gray, but if we're just putting sprinkles on a cake, it doesn't really add a lot of nutritional value, but it makes that cake look really pretty, right? So a lot of companies will just put a little dash, a little sprinkle, 1 milligram of something to say, hey, we have it in here, right? But the cool thing about a lot of professional companies, especially Ortho Molecular Products, I can speak on this, very honestly, because I work with them, is every product that we come out with, there's a specific reason why that amount is in there. Is there some sort of study, there's some sort of human clinical trial, or we seek out specific patented raw materials that have human clinical trials on them specifically, that shows, hey, if you take 600 milligrams of this for X number of days or X number of months, this is the outcome that we expect to see, right? So that's kind of the big difference, is putting things in there just to put them in there, or is it in there with a purpose? Is it in there for a reason? right?
I want to expand on that for a second, because not only do you do that, but you also try to, I believe, source your ingredients from whatever we want to call it, areas of the world where the studies have been done. Like, for instance, I've mentioned this before, I think on the show, with citrus bergamot, that we know there is a lot of evidence showing, right, the benefit of bergamot. However, Ortho Molecular sources their bergamot from Italy, from where that research was conducted. Because let's face it, someone in California can grow bergamot and then try to also sell that supplement, but that doesn't mean that those outcomes are going to translate into where the original research was done. I don't know how to explain that easily, but I think my point came across there.
No, you did. You explained it perfectly, because that's literally exactly what happens, right? So it actually goes back to the first question you asked me, which was about different parts of the world, different soil nutritional deficiencies. Absolutely. Right. Because if we grow, talking about citrus bergamot, which we know has specific bioactive polyphenolic fractions that actually help mediate our cholesterol pathways, right? Yeah. If we grow that plant in California versus if we actually grow it in Calabria, Italy, where the studies are done, where the initial studies by Dr. Vincenzo Malachi were done, talking about, again, different raw materials that are either patented or have research, which is what we're doing here. This is a perfect example. If we grow it in Southern California versus if we grow it in Italy, those are two completely different soil compositions, right? They're two completely different parts of the world. Maybe they've been farmed completely differently, right? The sun is different. The angle of the sun, the way that the sun is obviously the same, right? But the angle of the sun and how much sun they're getting and where they're getting the sun from is different. And it actually matters when it comes down to growing that plant, right? The amount of time that they're able to spend outside, basically the environment that's in, the humidity, everything. You can try to match it by going to different places, but that's not what Ortho does, right? Company like our own in the professional channel, we go where the research was done. The research was done in Italy by Italian doctors on that specific plant in that specific region of the world. So could we grow it in California? Yeah, and there are companies who do that, right? But Ortho is not going to source it from a company that's doing that where the research wasn't done. We're going to use the specific companies that are actually there working with those doctors to come out with those studies. So that's kind of actually a perfect example. I'm glad you brought that one up of exactly what I'm talking about, is actually growing it where it's supposed to be grown, using studies, and actually talking about getting high quality raw materials, because that's ultimately what it is.
Let's stay on raw materials, because the sourcing is also something that, sorry for the listeners, I am losing my voice here, a bit of a cold. So I'll be taking some immune support, which we're going to talk about in a little bit.
There we go.
Well, let's go back to sourcing. Can you give us some other examples of where Ortho seeks out, literally around the world, the best location to source individual ingredients? Because I know you guys search far and wide, and if something is unavailable, you're not going to be able to manufacture that supplement, because you're not going to compromise the quality of the product to get inferior sourcing, which may be even cheaper, right? Which that's what a lot of companies do. They get the cheapest ingredients. So spend some time talking about how Ortho sources the ingredients.
Yeah. So first off, we kind of have a China last policy as kind of our policy as it relates to sourcing raw materials, because a lot of raw materials that are coming out of that part of the world, either adulterated, they're very inferior. They've either been synthesized, with adulterants or things that get added to them that maybe we don't want patients taking. Right. There's certain extraction processes for different raw materials. I know you talked about this with Tom. And also I recommend any listener who wants to dig even more, it specifically, go listen to Tom Hull's episodes from the very beginning. He did a fantastic job. I could not do it any better than he did. But, there's a lot of raw materials that are extracted in ways that we necessarily don't want them to, right? Either using benzene as a way to actually perform that extraction process, which we don't want patients taking, or they're just from parts of the world where they're grown in environments where there's high pollutants. So I talk about environmental toxins that could end up in that raw material, especially as we talk about growing things like herbs and botanicals that are sitting there in their environment doing their thing. They're going to absorb these things that are coming out of factories and pollutants and part of runoff or whatever it may be. Right. So Ortho chooses to source a lot of raw materials actually out of Europe. There's a lot of really high quality raw material companies. We just talked about one, right? That's coming out of Italy, right? There's a lot of high quality raw material companies that are coming out of Europe or locally in the US that do a really, really, really fantastic job delivering a high quality raw material, right? So as it relates to price, obviously that's something consumers need to be concerned about. You kind of pay for what you get when it comes to the dietary supplement world, right? And are there companies charging more than they should for their products? Absolutely. So this is another one where it's kind of hard to sift through the weeds, but if you look at a higher quality company, they're going to charge a little bit more. So I would also say this is a good time to plug. If you see those buy one, get one frees, or you go, like you said, to Sam's Club, Walmart, and they've got, 200 capsules of fish oil for, $8, that's something I would question, right? Because why are they able to sell that for so little?
Yep, totally agreed. I don't know if you know off the top of your head, but can you, for the listeners, just to give them an example of, like, again, far and wide, where Ortho gets ingredients from? If I remember right, like your alpha lipoic acid comes from Germany. Is that correct?
Yep.
Where
Germany, Spain, obviously the United States. Our fish oil actually comes off the coast of Chile, which is the least industrialized coast in the entire world. We partner with a company down there that actually, they own the boats, they pay the fishermen, they own the entire process right there. So we don't need to ship it around, which actually leads to a really high quality product, which is awesome. We go places and we seek out the companies that make, and this is no exaggeration, the highest quality raw material that we can possibly put in a product. Because again, we work exclusively with licensed healthcare providers. So there are doctors, our practitioners, or pharmacists who have an expectation for their products when they give it to patients. And we know that every single day, right? So it comes down to our processes, our systems, actually what we're doing as it relates to our facility and how we're manufacturing, how we're testing, all of that comes together to make a high quality product. Absolutely.
Isn't your current facility, what was it, like $50 million or something? Or what, I mean, it's just huge. Is it like the largest? Brad, talk about.
Sure. Yeah. So we now have a 200,000 square foot facility, which is absolutely massive. I've been on a couple tours up there and it's incredible, right? It's state of the art, kind of sounds like a very flashy term, right? But there's automatic doors, there's people walking around, there's very high quality stuff. I'd love to talk about the lab if we could, because that's really where everything starts. So even though we are sourcing high quality raw materials, we're sourcing the highest you can possibly get. There's still an opportunity, even if a company is sending those raw materials to us. We have a list of approved vendors that we work with, but even if those companies are sending raw materials to us, there's an opportunity where either they made a mistake or something maybe is not quite what they thought it was, and they put it in a batch and they send it to us. We test absolutely anything and everything that comes to our facility. Every single raw material, every single product, every single anything that comes into our facility gets tested and it gets quarantined before we even begin to use it into a product, right? So what I mean by that is, let's say we get a big batch of vitamin C, right? Vitamin C can come from a lot of different countries, can come from a lot of different places, right? And a lot of people can hide a lot of different things in vitamin C, right? So that vitamin C comes in, what we do is we take a big sample of it. So we test it all the way through the bag or the vat or the barrel or whatever it's coming in, and we send that right to our lab. Right? And we have very smart people, fantastic people up in our lab. And what they do is they're performing everything from thin layer chromatography, mass spectrometry. So it's a pretty cool process. For those who don't know, they're shooting an electric beam, a laser beam essentially, into that raw material, and it bounces back, and we're able to read basically what those bands look like. I was a science major. I get very nerdy about these things, but we're able to basically read what those bands look like when they come back, right? In each specific compound, if I put vitamin C in that tube, or if I put vitamin D in that tube, they're going to have completely different outcomes, right? We're going to see a completely different band pattern. We know what they're supposed to look like, so we can compare them, right? And the cool thing is, and something I really appreciate about Ortho, is that if we get a raw material that doesn't meet our standards for whatever reason, falls outside of spec, we incinerate it. Because there's an opportunity, if that company made a mistake with us, right? I'm not saying it's insidious or intentional, but sometimes it may be, right? We have no idea. So if that company accidentally sends us something they're not supposed to, we incinerate that raw material. We have a company that comes, picks up stuff and actually destroys it, because we know if there's an opportunity for them to send that to us, they may also send it to another company.
Yeah.
So that's just another way that we help protect the channel, because we're very passionate about this. I don't know if you can tell, but we're very passionate about this. And we want to make sure that if we're doing everything we can, that we're also helping everybody else, right? We like the term raising tide, raise all ships, right? So if the tide's going up, everyone else is going up. If we can help do our part, we're actually doing that as well. So we also, expiration dates, that's another big thing that people can look for in a dietary supplement. We have expiration dates in all of our products. And the way that we do that, and it's a very regulated process, but the way that we do that is, once we manufacture a lot, or manufacture basically a giant batch of bottles, we have to take those bottles and store them separately. And what we do is, every 3 months, we pull a random sample out of that bottle. We do the exact same process all over again. So we take those raw materials, send them through the lab. We either send them, if it's a live organism like a probiotic, we actually PCR cycle to actually test to make sure that those strains are what we say they are, because we can't put anything in that bottle that isn't what it is, right? Yep. Or we're performing those same processes we did when we originally got the sample. Why are we doing that? It's because we want to guarantee that what we have on the label in the amount that we say is there is actually what's there. Because again, we work exclusively with licensed healthcare providers. We want to make sure that you guys are getting products that you can trust with your patients, which is awesome. I get very excited about this.
I talked a little bit about this on the episode with Tom Hool, and that for instance, your probiotics potencies, right, are guaranteed at the date of not manufacturing, but of expiration, right? Because you may purchase a probiotic over the counter that says 50 billion, colony forming units. Well, that may have had 50 billion colony forming units 2 months ago, but by the time you're putting it in your mouth, it may have 0 colony forming units. So that's another, from a marketing standpoint, right? Good marketing, how they label the bottle, but there's really no guarantee what it's going to be when it gets to your home. So if I remember right, you guys date based on, so like, for example, with probiotics, that expiration date that maybe you can explain this better, but the potency is still guaranteed at the date of expiration.
Yeah, so companies who manufacture probiotics get a lot of options as it relates to the language that they can actually put on that bottle, right? So what we choose to use is an expiration date. And a lot of consumers listening to, a lot of patients listening to this podcast are probably like, doesn't everyone use an expiration date? Shouldn't you use an expiration date? The answer is no, right? And the reason is because they don't have to, right? It's another opportunity for those companies, like I said earlier, who are more concerned about profits than patients. And they're actually going to make a product that necessarily doesn't really do a whole lot for that patient. So if you think about it, those probiotics, they're living organisms. They're alive like you and I are, right? So they die, they replicate, they die, they use nutrients, they exist. And over time, if I take that probiotic and I just leave it, over time, they're going to die. It is going to happen, right? So as it relates to manufacturing a product, a lot of companies can just put on the label, yeah, we put 20 billion CFUs, colony forming units, or probiotics at time of manufacture. What does that really mean, right? It means that when we made that product, we put 20 billion CFUs in there. That's it. That's all it means. It doesn't mean that they add anything to it that's actually going to help protect them. It doesn't mean that they're doing a specific packaging that helps keep them stable. They're not doing anything, right? So as it relates to that product, you can imagine, and I've seen data that actually suggests this, and we can talk about that in more detail at a different date, but that data suggests that, over time, these actually die really quickly. If you look at refrigerated probiotics, that's kind of what we call old school technology, right? Those companies are asking you to slow down that degradation process as much as possible by literally cooling the probiotics off, right? So there is no regulation on those probiotics after they've been manufactured. They don't have to, right? Which is obviously something that, I think needs to get changed, but it's something that Ortho is aware of. So we choose to use, again, the expiration date, because we want to say, hey, we've got 20 billion CFUs of a probiotic in that capsule. That's how much your patient is going to get if they take that product before the expiration date. It's a guarantee. It's a guarantee that if they take that, they're going to get at least that much.
And how can we guarantee that? And that, what are the things that you're saying other companies may not be doing? Like, what are you doing to preserve those organisms?
Yeah. So like I said, they're living organisms. They're going to replicate, they're going to die, they're going to do everything that, we would expect those little cellular organisms to do. So what we do a couple different things. So every company who makes probiotics has to freeze dry, right? Because that basically kind of knocks them out, if you want to think about it that way. Because otherwise they're going to be replicating very quickly. Right? They're going to be doing their thing very quickly. That's just how they exist, right? So what we do is we freeze dry them to kind of say, hey, go to sleep for a little bit, right? And then what we do is we spray them with this salt polysaccharide layer that basically acts as a coating, right? And acts as a basically like an M&M coating on an M&M shell, if you want to think about it that way, right? I know patients aren't eating a lot of M&Ms. It's okay. I do, but it's okay. If you think about it, when you open up that bag, you don't have a big puddle of mushy chocolate, right? You have individually, basically little beads of chocolate that are protected by this coating. It's the same concept with our probiotics, right? Is that they're sprayed with this layer. So when they get freeze dried, it protects their cellular membranes. It protects what they're doing. So that's one way that we do it. In addition to that, we also manufacture with a slight overage. So we know that even though we're doing that, we put a little bit extra in there, right? We don't bring that cost to the patient. That's something that we know that we have to do to make sure that that product is actually viable and is going to be something that's going to last, which leads to an ability where these products can actually be shelf stable. So now we're not requiring refrigeration, which is awesome, because if we think about it from, patient's perspective, we think about you guys, is that when you guys have all of your supplements and you have maybe any particular medication that you're taking or whatever it may be, if you're putting it in your pill counter, which is something I do, no shame in that, right? It's a way to organize, is that you can put those products in that pill counter. You can keep it with all of your other products or keep it with your medication, because I know what happens, right? You take that refrigerated probiotic, you put it up your shelf, you go out and you get your almond milk and your eggs and you bring them home and you put them up there, right? Where does it end up? It's back of the shelf, right? So what we're doing is we're just adding little bits and pieces, and we could do this for every product, but we're adding little bits and pieces that makes it a little bit easier for the patient to take. And again, more therapeutic. That's just one example with our probiotics that demonstrates that. We could go over pretty much every product and give a reason for that, which is awesome. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I want to go back to the lab though. So I love that you're basically saying to the listeners, we test every single ingredient to make sure that it is what it says it is, right? But I know there's another piece of that because you're also looking to see if there are any contaminants, correct? So what are other things you're looking for that you don't want to be in the product?
Yeah, absolutely. So even some of those botanicals and some of those raw materials, we take little agar plates, which are these little gel plates, and we actually spread that on there and we actually see what grows, right? So we want to see if there's any potential, like you see things get recalled for salmonella or some of these other potential, they're pathogens. They're not good.
Yeah.
Right. Or we're actually seeing if there's anything that's specifically added to it. Right. So maybe talk about vitamin C again, that isn't vitamin C that ended up in that vitamin C sample. That's not something we want, right? Because if we say that there's 600 milligrams of vitamin C in a particular product, well, then we have to guarantee that that 600 milligrams we're putting in there is the vitamin C. And if it's not vitamin C, again, that's an opportunity for us to say, hey, we need to incinerate this, and then go back to our vendor and say, hey, what are you guys doing? What's going on here?
Sure. What about heavy metals, chemicals?
Yep, absolutely.
Looking for all that? Okay.
All of those heavy metals, chemicals, pesticides, anything that we would be concerned with that we don't want patients taking concentrated, obviously, in a product every single day. That's something we're obviously looking for as well.
Awesome. Just taking a few notes here. I want to go back to fish oil.
Sure.
I do want to get to like how supplements are regulated and whatnot, but I want to go back to fish oil for a minute because you mentioned you're sourcing this off the coast of Chile. And I know in a quick, short ad or commercial that I do run on the podcast, I talk about the seed to shelf life. But for listeners who don't know, or seed to shelf time, I should say, of many fish oil products. But for listeners who don't know what I'm talking about, let's talk just a little bit, stay on the topic of fish oil and where you're sourcing it and how fresh it is, and kind of brag about that, because I think that's really important.
Sure, I could brag about that. So the fish oil industry, if you guys want to know how that is basically done, is every single fish oil, it doesn't matter who it is, doesn't matter if it's us or the Costco brand or you name it. What happens is people obviously catch fish, right? So they're catching fish, they go out there, and then the first process, the literal first thing that they do is they physically squeeze those fish. And when we physically squeeze those fish, what we're trying to do is extract the oil, right? We're trying to get that oil out of the fish. But you can imagine, when we actually squeeze those fish, we get a lot more than just the oil, right? I'm not talking about guts and eyeballs and all that gross stuff that we don't want in our product either. We end up with whatever toxic material, microplastic, heavy metal, you name it. Mercury is a big one. We end up with whatever that fish consumed over the course of its lifetime, right? So every single company does this. We press them out, take out the oil, and then what we need to do in order to actually extract and purify that is we actually perform a process called molecular distillation. And molecular distillation is basically a very fancy way of saying we're going to take that, we're going to purify that compound to remove all the heavy metals, all the toxic components, microplastics, whatever it is, to leave us with a fish oil, right? To leave us with an actual oil that we can put in a capsule. Problem with this process is, in order to do that first step, what we have to do, what they are is triglycerides. That oil is actually a triglyceride. Is we actually have to remove that glycerol backbone and reattach an alcohol ethyl backbone onto that product. So now it becomes what's called an ethyl ester. And for the patients, this is an alcohol-based backbone fish oil. This is what you will find well over 90% of the time if you go buy that big bottle from Costco, and it's $8, right? And it's very inexpensive, and it's got 200 capsules in there, and you're probably really excited, right? You open it up, what does it smell like? It smells like fish. Right? Or if we take that product, we start burping up fish, right? The reason is that fat, it's fat, right? So it's going to oxidize really quickly, especially in the presence of alcohol. Whereas the alcohol-based backbone is going to make that oil go rancid a little bit quicker. That's what those fish burps are. When patients take fish oil, and I'm sure there's someone who's like, oh my gosh, what am I doing? Listen to this right now, that fish oil actually becomes rancid and it goes bad quickly. And then when you burp it, that's what you're tasting, which is gross, right? So what Ortho does, and this is another opportunity, again, we eat this cost. We don't, deliver just to the patients. Notice our actually fish oil is relatively cost efficient compared to that, is that we actually perform a second molecular distillation, because we're not going to leave that raw material in the ethyl form, right? The ethyl ester form. And this comes down to the science behind it, right? So we talk about reasons why we do things. There's a study, there's a reason, there's some sort of scientific article or thought process that goes behind everything, right? We know that the ethyl ester is not as incorporated as well into the cell membranes, which is actually where the rubber meets the road. That's where fish oil is actually able to interrupt inflammatory pathways, where we're actually able to reduce inflammation at the cellular level, right? So what we do is we perform that second round of molecular distillation, where we actually take off our alcohol backbone again, and we reattach glycerol backbone back on. So now we have what's called a reesterified triglyceride. It's reesterified triglyceride, which is the same form that's coming out of the fish, right? So that's the form that you would get if you're actually consuming the fish. And we know that this is incorporated, and there's numbers I could throw, but this is incorporated significantly better into the cell membranes, right? This is going to be significantly better for the patient. So if you think about, again, cost of raw materials, cost of what patients are actually getting, most expensive dietary supplement is the one that doesn't work, right? Or the one that patients won't take, right? So the one that patients are actually going to get more benefit from by taking less, in my opinion, that's more valuable than the one patients have to take more of to get less outcomes, right? So as it relates, circling back to our product and how it actually relates to the quality, is that we partner with a company off the coast of Chile that pays for the boats. They own the molecular distillation plant. They own the encapsulation plant. They own everything. The entire process exists off the coast of Chile, right? So they pay the fishermen, they go out, they catch the fish, they bring them back, and immediately they start to perform molecular distillation, excuse me. So what they do is they actually perform that distillation there. They perform that second round of distillation there, and then they encapsulate it and send it right back to us. That entire process happens relatively quickly, right? So we think about the retail space, a company that is looking specifically to lower the cost of their goods, they're going to send that fish oil wherever it's least expensive to perform that process. Wherever it's the most cost-effective solution for that company is where they're going to take that product, right? So if they're catching the fish, or they may not be catching fish, but if they just buy the fish, whatever kind of cheap fish is available, right, in mass bulk, and they actually send it out, perform that molecular distillation, say, hey, we're good with the ethyl ester. That's fish oil. We don't need to worry about it, right? And then we send that off to a company that's going to do the encapsulation. They may be in different parts of the country or different parts of the world, excuse me, right? So they have to send this product out. And the way that they do that is actually freeze that fish. So that fish is on ice for a very, very long time, right? A little too long. So the industry average for catch to capsule time for any fish oil, and this may gross out some of the listeners, is about 18 to 36 months. So
which is nuts. When I first heard that, I was like, what?
Yep.
Like, that's nuts.
So I like to fish. I like to go out and actually eat my own fish, which is great, right? If I had a fish in my freezer that was a year and a half to, 36 months old,
I would not eat it.
I'm not eating that, right? So compare that to ours. Our average catch to capsule time partnering with this company is about 3 to 6 months. Right.
Which is amazing,
so
which is the best in the industry, period. You're not going to find better, period. Yep.
Night and day difference, right? Which obviously leads to a higher quality product. And if patients try fish oil, which I recommend you to do, right? Your longevity blueprints fish oil. What we're actually going to see is that we're not going to be burping up that fish oil like we would if you're just taking something from the retail space. You're not going to taste that product.
So not only is it fresh, what you said before is you guys are essentially taking on the cost of it's called reesterifying the fish oil with the triglyceride form, which is the form you would get if you were eating salmon, if you were eating fish, right? Which is easier for your body to absorb.
Absolutely.
You're getting an easier version that's fresher, right? That's still distilled of any potential contaminants. And I believe this fish oil we're talking about is sourced from sardines and anchovies too. Is that correct? Smallest
possible fish we can. This goes back to a biological concept called bioaccumulation, where and this is super oversimplified, but if that anchovy eats one toxic particle, that anchovy has one toxic particle in it, right? But if a salmon comes along and eats 100 anchovies, well, that salmon now has 100 toxic particles inside of it, right? It's a lot easier to process these smaller fish because they're less likely to consume other fish that have high concentrations of toxic material inside of them. Absolutely.
So just in general for the listeners, you want to avoid fish oil that comes from larger fish. So if it says salmon oil or tuna oil or whatnot, bad, you can just get rid of that right there. So this is excellent. Let's go back to how supplements are regulated. You've touched a little bit on this, but obviously you guys have an amazing facility and you highly regulate your Big products, time. But tell us in general how supplements are regulated, because I do think a lot of consumers just assume, well, if I do go to, I keep saying Walmart, but any big box store, the product's going to be safe. And if it says it has, 1,000 milligrams of vitamin C, it's going to have vitamin C. And, that must be the dose that I need. I think they assume that, and that's not the case. So expand on what your answer would be to how supplements are regulated.
I wish that was the case. I wish the patients could go into any store and there's a high quality product available, and this is available to the masses, and this is something that's just everywhere, and there's a really good understanding of what's in products and what patients can take, because that would lead to a lot healthier country, in my opinion. But the problem is as we get a big influx, right? We're talking about post-COVID-19 and patients more concerned about, their health and wellness than they ever have been. We get a big influx, and this is a problem even before, but you get a big influx of these companies that just start popping up to make products because they want shelf space. That's what they want, right? They want their product on the shelf that you can go and purchase. They make $1 every time you do that, right? So what we see is that these products, and I think that's a big misconception. You addressed this one with Tom, which was awesome. That's a big misconception that dietary supplements aren't regulated. They're highly, highly, highly regulated, right? The Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, comes through our facility every now and then. It's not a consistent number, but every now and then, and they will actually ask for, and we have to record. So I'm going to rewind a little bit, but every time that we get a batch in and we weigh it out, and we open it and we do something, we have to have an individual who physically does that. And then we have to have a second person who stands there and actually records and verifies that that's the amount that's coming in or coming out of that specific raw material. And the FDA comes and they regulate that. They actually ask for all of our papers and they look for irregularities, right? So our facility receives very, very, very high scores. The FDA, I like to say, likes us because we do a pretty good job, right? And the FDA is actively, and it's kind of an uphill battle because there's more companies being created, in my opinion, than the FDA has the ability to actually go out and shut down, right? They pop up, they start making products. And I'm not even saying these are big facilities like ours, they're small operations, right? So they pop up, make products. Maybe they're making claims that aren't true, that they can't make, that are illegal. Or they're making products that are maybe adulterated or unsafe for the consumer. The FDA has to go out, actively see them before they can shut them down, right? So we talk about products that are available in the retail space. Sometimes that market is going a little bit faster than the FDA can. But it's a big misconception to think that we're not regulated or that we're not regulated like pharmaceuticals, because in most cases, we are regulated just like pharmaceuticals. We're making products for patients, right? And the FDA is aware of that. So they want to see everything. They want to know from start to finish how we're doing something, what we're putting in a product, and that we verified that that is correct, and that we're testing and actually doing all the things that we're supposed to, which we do, which is fun to say.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So how do some companies, do some companies get by with contaminated products just because, like you're saying, is your answer to that the FDA can't quite keep up with some of these smaller shops? Is that?
Yeah, I mean, people just keep popping up, and it's an unfortunate time right now. I mean, it's a great time for dietary supplements that people are actually carrying and doing things, right? But just like with everything, there's bad people out there who aren't really concerned about the patients. What they're concerned about is profits, right? Sure. So they just want to make a product to get it on the shelf, and that's really all that they care about, right? Especially online. As online sales boom, as we see more patients trying to seek this stuff out online and get answers online, you see a lot of stuff that's just flashy marketing, right? So it's kind of an uphill battle, but the FDA does highly, highly, highly regulate it. And they do shut down people who aren't doing things that they're supposed to. They've got a checklist that they walk through. And if you're not following procedures, you're not allowed to make dietary supplements, period.
Sure. But that doesn't mean that the ingredients from all these other companies are sourced appropriately or in therapeutic potencies for certain clinical conditions.
Correct.
I just want to make that disclaimer. So that was wonderful. I love talking about just Ortho Molecular's facility. Obviously, I'm very proud. Sure. That's who, manufactures the Your Longevity Blueprint products. So let's get into, we kind of talked a little bit about immune support and adrenals. Sure. Earlier. We mentioned that. I think let's get into how supplements play a role in overall health. So, and we'll talk about some unique conditions. So what, in your opinion, what supplements should we be taking to maximize our health?
Yeah, so we call it foundational 4. I kind of expanded to foundational 5 because I think there's a 5th thing that a lot of patients are deficient in that we need. But if we talk about why patients need to be taking a dietary supplement, which was, I think, one of the first questions you asked me, kind of a loaded question, right? But as it relates to patients between function and dysfunction, there's 2 things that separate. I'm talking about organ systems, cellular health, whatever it is, function and dysfunction. There's 2 things that separate that kind of protect us from that. One of those is metabolic resiliency, and the other one is metabolic reserves. And what I mean by that, metabolic resiliency is our overall health, essentially the cellular health, the ability of these organ systems to bounce back from change, to bounce back from stresses, as we talked about before. Metabolic reserves is our gas tank. That's how many micronutrients we have available to us at any given time that our cells can pull from and actually perform a function, right? Every cell in our body requires micronutrients, especially when we're stressed, especially when those organ systems, chronic disease, physical, mental, emotional, whatever it is, any type of stress in our body is going to start searching for our metabolic reserves in order to improve our metabolic resiliency, right? So when we suffer in either of those two categories, that's when we reach dysfunction. That's when we end up in an environment where we no longer are functioning the way that we're supposed to, right? So the first product, that being said, the first product that I usually recommend patients take is a high quality multivitamin, right? Something that is going to address a broad spectrum of micronutrient deficiencies. Just get something, in our system that is going to be broad spectrum, if you want to think about it that way. There's a lot of really good, high potency, high quality raw materials, right? That's going to help patients have high maximum metabolic reserves, is the way that I'll put it, right? After that, probiotics, gut health, right?
Yep.
When we talk about probiotics, so we want to regulate and avoid dysbiosis, because as soon as we fall into dysbiosis, that has been linked with a host of chronic disease, right? Health starts in the gut, right? Health starts in the gut. Our gut is linked to a lot of different organ systems. So making sure they're on probiotics is essential, right? And these are also things I take every day too. I should mention that, and I'm sure you do as well, Dr. Gray. Fish oil, like we just talked about, reducing inflammation. We talk about standard American diet, called the SAD diet, right? So that diet, there's been a big shift away from our healthy omegas, right? Talking about our omega-3 to omega-6 ratio, and we can balance that out. And what I'm talking about is processed foods, right? So things where basically the oils are more shelf stable, but they're not as good for you. So I'm talking about vegetable oil, canola oil, some soybean oil, some of these really not good oils, just put it that way, that increase inflammation. So actually pro-inflammatory in the body. Right. So we can balance out that ratio a little bit by supplementing with omega-3, EPA, and DHA to actually balance that ratio back out. So our body has some anti-inflammatory aspect going through its system. Right. And then after that, we want to make sure we're taking vitamin D. I live in Iowa. I'm from the Chicago suburbs. We don't get enough sun here. I was just in my basically apartment for 3 months straight because it's been snowing and cold and there's nothing to do outside. Right. Which is unfortunate, but it is kind of the reality of the situation. And vitamin D, a lot of people look at more as a steroid than they do just a vitamin, right? Because it regulates over 2,000 different genes that once activated help with neurotransmitter production. They also help with immune function. They help with a whole host of different things. That list is very expansive. Vitamin D is absolutely essential, right? And then the last one that personal favorite of mine is magnesium. Absolutely magnesium. Because if we talk about magnesium, it's involved with hundreds of enzymatic processes in our bodies. It's involved with well over 80% of our enzymatic processes in our bodies, right? But in addition to that, well over 80% of our patients are deficient, because where do we get magnesium? Spinach, right? There's a lot of green leafy vegetables that we can get it in. There's other sources, a little bit of dairy milk, which obviously we're not going to be, super keen on, right? But the point is it's a lot of things that a lot of patients aren't eating a lot of times because we talk about standard American diet. It's really easy just to bring magnesium in through supplementation.
Yep. So I'm going to echo what you just said. So you're saying many patients should kind of start with these foundational supplements.
Yep.
So, comprehensive multivitamin, probiotic. When you said omega-3s, that means fish oil, what we were just talking about, vitamin D and magnesium. So I 100% agree with that. And I would say I've tested, thousands of patients. I've been in practice over a decade, and I've tested so many individuals. Most people on a micronutrient deficiency test are going to need all of these. They just are. Many of my patients have very high need for magnesium. If you're stressed and you exercise and drink coffee and whatnot and don't eat well, you're going to need a lot of magnesium. So I agree with those. I do want to kind of differentiate a regular multivitamin from the fancy mitochondrial complex that I love. I apologize, keep losing my voice here. I accidentally this morning, as I'm feeling a little under the weather, had my supplements laid up for the day. I took both of the I took the prenatal and mitochondrial complex.
Sure. Got a lot of good micronutrients today.
I normally don't do that, but I took both because I think both are excellent products, and we have the complete multivitamin. Okay. So I take mitochondrial complex specifically for energy. I noticed just a big shift when I started taking it years ago, that wow, my brain's functioning better, my energy is better. So let's talk as I digress there. Let's talk about what nutrients can really help maximize cellular energy, because some of those are in mitochondrial complex. So first, above and beyond those 5 products you laid out, let's talk about cellular energy, what our body needs, and then go into the mitochondrial complex.
Yeah, energy is paramount, right? Because that's the thing that most patients are going to notice pretty quickly when you all of a sudden don't have the energy that you're quite used to, right? So this can be as a result of, and it's tied to intimately with chronic disease, right? So anytime we're challenged, we talk about stresses, physiological stresses, anytime we're challenged with chronic disease, we can see basically a burden on that metabolic reserve, as we talked about earlier. And when we burden those metabolic reserves, Now we're in an environment where maybe we don't have the nutrients we need to produce energy in the way that we used to, right? Or as we become mentally stressed, as we become physically and mentally stressed, it affects our adrenal glands, which I know we'll dig into a little bit in a minute, because I know you keep asking about it. But what we're talking about when we're talking about metabolic, actual mitochondrial function, mitochondria, as most people know, powerhouse of the cell, right? That's where all of our energy for every cell comes from. As we make ATP, that's where it begins, right? And those mitochondria actually are pretty sensitive to change. They're pretty sensitive to damage, right? Believe it or not. So I always grew up, as a biology major. I went, obviously went to the University of Illinois and studied biology there. You always see that little diagram that has one mitochondria in it. That's the little diagram that we see. But depending on the cell, we can actually have anywhere from 500 to 2,000 mitochondria that was in those cells, right? So a lot of energy dependent tissues, so talking about like the heart and the brain, high concentration of mitochondria in those tissues, right? So as it relates to, cellular function, they can be damaged as we, see things like oxidative stress, where we talk about things like chronic disease, talk about inflammation, all of that can affect our mitochondria. When our mitochondrial health suffers, now we don't have the cellular energy that we normally do in order to function at a high level. And this can affect our metabolic resiliency, right? So not only are we draining metabolic reserve, but now we're draining metabolic resiliency as well. Every organ system, every organ in our body requires those mitochondria to be functioning at a very high capacity in order for us to be basically maintaining regular health, right? So as it relates to products, there's kind of what we call the big three or the power trio. There's a lot of fun marketing terms for it, right? But it's really three key nutrients that help dictate how much energy we're able to bring into cells and what we're actually able to do once it's there, right? So what I'm talking about is acetyl-L-carnitine, alpha-lipoic acid, and N-acetylcysteine, right? So acetyl-L-carnitine, what we know is that acetyl-L-carnitine has been shown in the literature to draw free fatty acids across the organelle membrane into the mitochondria. And what this is this is like we have a car, we've got a furnace, or whichever analogy we like to use, right? We've got a car, we're pressing on the gas and we're putting more gas in that tank and we're pressing on the gas, right? So what we're doing is we're making the car go faster. Mitochondria is our car in this instance, right? So we're actually able to get more fuel into that, and we're actually able to process that fuel better because the mitochondria are just waiting to use the free fatty acids, right? They're waiting to use those and actually make energy. But when we do that, right, just like in a car, we've got a catalytic converter, we need to actually clean up that exhaust that's created, right? Or if we have a furnace, we need to basically put a filter on that. And that furnace, that filter that we're looking for is basically something to balance out what are called free radicals, which is oxidative stress. The mitochondria, as lovely as they are little free radical factories, right? They love making oxidative stress. It's just a byproduct of their existence. And what I mean by free radicals is they're basically unbound electrons that sit in our system and they can cause damage. And they've been linked to, there's studies that have been linked to for 30 plus years now, cardiovascular disease, neurotransmitter dysfunction. We can make a long list of that too, right? Immunological dysfunction. Oxidative stress is not good for our systems, right? So lifestyle factors that can increase oxidative stress, and all of this damages mitochondria as well. But lifestyle factors increase oxidative stress are things like diabetes, smoking, drinking, even exercise. Sorry to say for anyone who is exercise buff, exercising, intense or moderate to intense activity can increase oxidative stress throughout our body, right?
Especially over exercising.
Yeah, absolutely, right? You're taxing your body. Your body is working very hard to create energy, right? Which can increase our oxidative stress that's produced, right? So what we need to do is balance that out with antioxidants. Antioxidants being components that actually go in and deoxidize, if you want to think about it that way, different components that carry free radicals around our system, right? So alpha-lipoic acid, in addition to being an antioxidant itself, is able to recharge other antioxidants in our cells and our bodies, like vitamin C. And then N-acetylcysteine is an essential precursor to glutathione, right? And I see you smiling. Glutathione is our master antioxidant in our body. It's one of our favorite components that just sitting around. It helps with our liver, helps with, again, cellular detoxification. It's massively important, very huge, right? So those three components together work to basically put more gas in the gas tank, press on that gas pedal and make sure that that car's going, but also put a really nice catalytic converter on that car and make sure that that exhaust is being cleaned up, right?
So again, in summary, those were carnitine, alpha-lipoic acid, and N-acetylcysteine for the listeners, which are included in mitochondrial complex.
Conveniently, right?
Yeah. Conveniently included.
Yeah.
So talk about mitochondrial complex for a minute here.
Yeah.
And why that, I know there's some other ingredients in there too, but why that's such a powerful product.
Absolutely. So it starts basically kind of like a multivitamin, right? I don't like saying it's like a multivitamin because it kind of undersells what the product is, right? But if we look at that micronutrient list, it looks a lot like a multivitamin. You have your A's, your B's, C, D, everything is in that supplement facts box, right? And the reason for that is, if we think about back to our car analogy, before we even put the engine in the car and press on the gas, where's the car? Right? We need to have those micronutrients available to the mitochondria, available to the cell in order to build a nice car. We need to be able to put the tires on, put the metal, doors in, to actually put the windows in, to make sure there's a steering wheel. We got to go somewhere, right? We need all of those micronutrients available in order to basically support mitochondrial health as best as we can. And obviously other organ systems as well. But the main focus is making sure these mitochondria are healthy and ready to go. Right. But in addition to that, in addition to the power trio that we talked about, there's also some really good phytonutrients in there. The phytonutrients act as further antioxidant support is essentially why they're in there. So talking about transresveratrol, that's the potent antioxidant found in red wine, right? Then we also talk about EGCG, which come from green tea extract, sulforaphane coming from broccoli seed extract. There's a lot of good phytonutrients and antioxidants found in that product to help support every process we just talked about. That, when you combine all that together, it's like building it's like building a Cadillac, right? It's building the nicest car we can think of, making sure that we have high quality gas in there, and then making sure that that catalytic converter is clean and working the way that it's supposed to.
So this is the Escalade, or this is the
yeah, it's a nice car. Yeah. Yeah.
I obviously love the product. I take it every day. So that obviously all of what you just said can help fuel our cells, so help with energy. There are other supplements that can also help with energy. We talked a little bit about B vitamins. Can you talk about B's for a minute here, as those are important for energy too?
Yeah, so B vitamins are essential for energy production. In fact, if you just pop into Google, and I know a lot of patients probably do this, but I have low energy, what do I do, right? You'll find that B vitamins are found in that system, right? B vitamins are essential for a lot of different processes, and tons of processes, right? So we're talking about liver detoxification, right? Which can make patients feel like they have low energy, as our liver is burdened by removing toxic substances from our body. Also with neurotransmitter production, when we want to make things like serotonin and GABA and dopamine, we need B vitamins in order to complete those cycles. There's different steps from point A to point B to point C that require B vitamins to convert that. They're involved in different cycles for cardiovascular function, right? B vitamins are paramount. And in fact, that's why you see a high concentration of B vitamins in products like mitochondrial complex, or basically any essential multivitamin, because we need those for a lot of different processes. And when we don't have those available to complete those cycles, that's when we start seeing patients fall into dysfunction again, or maybe we don't have the same energy that we used to because we're fighting. Our body is fighting to complete that process. Again, going back to metformin, right? If we're on prescription like metformin, or even some of these other things, it's estrogens or some of these other prescriptions, it's going to block up B vitamins.
Yep. Birth control. I think that's what you're alluding to. Birth control can really rob us of B vitamins. We need B vitamins because we've already talked for an hour here. This is a long energy. We should take a B vitamin break.
Yeah, right.
So thank you for sharing about B vitamins. I want to next go to the adrenals, because many individuals who have fatigue have stressed their adrenals. And I know Ortho Molecular does manufacture many products that are very supportive to the adrenals. So how would someone know if they have an adrenal issue? And then let's talk about agents that can help.
Yeah. So I think this one, it's, again, kind of insidious. This is something that maybe we start noticing over a long period of time, right? There's a lot of people, as you talk about the COVID days, right? This is something which we're still in, right? But this is something that we talk about. Patients wake up one day and they realize that they, again, just not quite feeling right. Maybe you've got brain fog. Maybe you've got low energy, low mood that maybe you look back a year or two ago and you didn't quite have. Right. I was actually a patient on stage 3 end of this, where I wasn't producing enough cortisol. This is something that you have to work on with a practitioner to actually see some benefit from. Right. So what we're talking about what's called the HPA axis, and it stands for, or what it is, it's the hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal gland. Right. So we have this system that is meant to release cortisol. And I'm sure a lot of people have heard of cortisol. It's our stress hormone. You want to think about it that way. But cortisol is essential, right? If you think about it, way back in the day, and let's say that I'm not sitting in my apartment and you're not sitting in your office, right? We're out in the woods, whatever it may be, and we see a bear, right? You and I are out by the campfire and we see a bear. What we need, or what we want our body to actually do, is release cortisol, because cortisol will release cause different processes in our body that actually gets us up and gets us moving. Right. That's something that regulates diurnally. So over the course of the day, it regulates different patterns that actually create function, to get us up and get us thinking and get us moving and get us doing things. Right. So what we need to do is we need to take a look at nowadays, especially as, we're not encountering as many bears as we used to, thankfully. There are other metabolic systems or other, biological systems that can affect that process. So talking about issues with sleep, talking about issues with glycemic control, talking about issues, mental, emotional stress is a big one, right? There's a lot of factors that are no longer a bear, but they trick our systems, trick our body into thinking that there's a bear by triggering that fight or flight, triggering that cortisol release, which is going to tell the body is, hey, let's go. We got to start pumping something because we're stressed. We're physically stressed, right? Mm-hmm. So from a patient's perspective, you may be saying, what does any of that mean, right? We may wake up one day and maybe we have a hard time getting up in the morning. Or maybe we have, we're staying up late at night and we just can't fall asleep and we're not sure why, right? So there's two big patient types we talk about. That's our stressed and wired and our stressed and tired. Right. So if I say this is you, this is maybe an indicator, or if you're saying, this might sound like me, maybe this is an indicator, to go maybe look into this. Right. But our stressed and wired would be someone who gets up, pop right out of bed. Right. Maybe they have a hard time falling asleep too, but they pop right out of bed. Now these patients are like, go, 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 go. We got to get food on the table. Got to go do this. Got to get to work. Got to come home. Got to make sure all the homework's done. Got to make sure everything's going. Go, 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 go. Have a hard time kind of turning your brain off. What's happening is your body is producing cortisol and releasing cortisol really quickly. Right. So we have elevated cortisol levels pretty much throughout the day, and your cortisol is supposed to go up and then kind of slowly over time, wane as we get closer to bed. Right. The other person, our stressed and tired person, this is down and out, but still stressed. Right. This is a person who is very much stressed, but maybe saying, I'm getting beat up pretty good right now. I don't have the energy that I used to. It's hard to wake up. Maybe you come home at 5 o'clock. I was this patient at one point, but you come home at 5 o'clock and you need to take a nap after your third cup of coffee that day, right? This problem exists because we've, sat ourselves in stage one, which is that high release of cortisol. That whole system, the HPA axis, especially the adrenal glands, say, okay, enough's enough, right? We need to turn the system off because we're doing this a little too much, right? So this is one that patients will really feel. This is one that affects everyday life, quality of life as it relates to mood. So talking about low mood or whatever it may be, and then talk about our energy levels, too high or too low. And then even in between as the day goes on.
Sure. So you know this, but obviously last week my husband had emergency surgery. He's fine now, but in the moment and all last week, I just had so many things going on and I still had to work full time and see patients. So I was in that fight or flight, high cortisol state. Now, luckily I was aware of supplements to, calm my cortisol at night. So I had no problem sleeping. I slept just fine, thankfully. But we're going to encounter those stressors through our lives. And sometimes the stressors are one day or a week or whatnot. The goal is that we don't have high stress for a lifetime, or that we don't get stuck in that fight or flight, right? Now, this week is the opposite. I'm tired. So last week I was running with high cortisol. This week, my body's kind of like, okay, we're kind of trying to adjust, kind of catch up. So this week I'm more tired, but I do see patients who come in who have high cortisol. I have patients who come in, we can test for this. This is where saliva cortisol testing is very helpful. Who have high cortisol. I have some patients who have very, very low cortisol. They can barely get out of bed. They have crashed and burned. They have had too high cortisol for too long and now actually need help raising their cortisol. And so again, really questioning the patient on symptoms and comparing that with saliva testing can help us determine kind of what stage of adrenal stress they're in. And then there are supportive products that can be very helpful that I've taken for years. So share with us a little bit about the adrenal products that Ortho Molecular manufactures, some key ingredients in those.
Yeah. So something that we look for in a good adrenal product is something that helps maintain, again, I'm going to talk a lot about resiliency, especially when it comes to adrenal glands, but something that helps maintain resiliency. So what I'm talking about is something called adaptogens, right? Yes. And adaptogens, the big one most people are aware of, most people know it as the calming herb, right? Ashwagandha. Right. Ashwagandha, rhodiola, eleuthero, schisandra, all of those are herbs that are meant to increase resiliency of the adrenal glands. So, I played football in high school, rugby in college. The thought process is bend, don't break. I got told that by a lot of coaches, right? Tough stuff happens, bend, don't break. Similar concept with the rubber band. You want that rubber band to stretch. You want to have stress occasionally. That's okay. So rubber band stretches, but it doesn't snap. It's able to go back and then stretch it again, goes back, stretch it again, go back. But if I sat here all day just doing this, which I'm not going to do, but if I sat here doing this all day, eventually that rubber band would snap, right? So the idea is that these help maintain resiliency, which basically protects and heals the adrenal glands from a supportive herbal standpoint. From there, we kind of build on top of that to address the actual cortisol component, which is huge, right? Because if patients are actually looking to affect their cortisol values, which kind of resets the system a little bit in a way. There's two main raw materials that help us go one of two different ways, right? So if patients are producing or in an environment where they're producing a lot of cortisol and releasing a lot of cortisol, what we want to talk about is something called phosphatidylserine. So that process, and I know I'm going to get a little bit in the weeds here, but that process, hypothalamus, pituitary to adrenal glands, what happens is the pituitary sends out a signaling molecule called ACTH. And ACTH hits those adrenal glands and tells the adrenal glands to release cortisol, right? So phosphatidylserine is able to blunt that ACTH response. And when we blunt that response, what's happening is the adrenal glands now aren't getting that signal as much as they used to. Right. So basically what this means is now we're going to be in an environment where the body is producing and releasing less cortisol, which for a patient who's got elevated stress response, right, who's, maybe husband went in for emergency surgery.
Right.
This is something we want to look at because that's something that can dampen that cortisol response, and long-term elevated cortisol, like you had mentioned, is bad. It's not a good thing. Right.
Quite frankly, I take that every single night. Out all day last week.
Yeah.
I feel like many times I'm go, all day long, seeing patients, right, and trying to run a practice and whatnot, be a mom and exercise and all these things you got to fit into the day, right? So at night, I feel like I need something to just dampen the cortisol and just get my body calmed down. So phosphatidylserine, I love. I've taken that for years.
Yeah.
There's another one of my favorite ingredients that I've mentioned on the show, which is L-theanine, which can also be helpful. Can you expand on that benefit?
Yeah, L-theanine is one of my favorite raw materials because it's just absolutely fantastic. It's an amino acid that's found in green tea. It's part of the reason why people love drinking green tea and have for thousands and thousands of years so much. It's a very, very, very calming raw material. Right. So it helps patients regulate brainwave activity. So if you actually look at, and we hook people up and we look at their brainwave output, right now, my brain is obviously doing this. It's going very quickly, hopefully.
Yes.
Right. What L-theanine does is it helps us return, or what we see as a result of taking L-theanine, I should say, is it helps us return to more of a calm and relaxed state. Right. So we include L-theanine in a lot of our formulations for that reason. It's very safe. It's something a lot of patients can take. A lot of really cool research too for patients with anxiety and some other say high brainwave disorders.
So it's in our formulation called Adrenal Calm, right? So when patients are revved up and they need to calm down, we have a product that has all of the herbs you mentioned, plus the phosphatidylserine, plus the L-theanine, which I love. But you can also take L-theanine on its own. So if someone wakes up in the middle of the night and they just can't quite shut their brain off, want to get back to sleep, they need something that's quick acting. Or every time I've mentioned this also on the show, before some interviews, but before every time I've really ever publicly spoken, I always take L-theanine because it just kind of calms me down a bit. I already talk fast, so watch out. Like here I come. I need something that's going to just take me down a notch, but help me focus. So L-theanine can be used for anxiety, can be used even for social anxiety. Can be very helpful. So I love that. So what about patients who don't need calm down, who need revved up? What about on the opposite spectrum? So the patients not with high cortisol, with low cortisol, what do we have for them?
So we build it the same way. We're talking about adaptogens still because the adrenal glands are stressed. We talk a lot about stress. Stress means a lot of different things. The adrenal glands are still stressed in this instance. I can't talk. But what we're doing is now we're going to take a different approach. We're actually going to incorporate something called licorice root. Right. So licorice root is the actual root of the licorice plant, right? So what we're doing is we're incorporating licorice root because what it does, and this is a long word, I apologize, but it blocks something called 11-beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase, which is an enzyme, which is an enzyme that is responsible for converting cortisol into its inactive cousin, cortisone. And when the body has a high conversion rate, it leaves less of that, and the way we measure is free salivary cortisol, leaves less of that to be tested, right? Which means that a patient's going to be in a scenario where they don't have enough, right? So what we're trying to do is we're trying to block up that enzyme, 11-beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase, which is responsible for taking cortisol away from cortisol. We want to leave as much cortisol as possible for a patient who's maybe not releasing it or producing it as much, right? So obviously these patients, they're in stage 1 for a long time, right? They're in a high elevated cortisol pattern for a long time. So now they want to be in an environment where we have to basically stimulate that production, got to ramp up the engine again, start cranking it, start turning it. So this can take, for a lot of patients, it can take a while to get back to, normal function. This is something that, might be a long-term approach. It's hard to put a specific time frame on it, but I want to make patients aware it takes a while.
And so actually, well, no, I'll stay here for a minute. And there's another ingredient, right? The essentially adrenal extract from an animal that can also help raise cortisol. Can you mention that?
Yeah, it's a bovine adrenal concentrate is essentially what it is. So it's adrenal glands. It's kind of gross for some people to think about, but it's totally safe and normal, right? But it's adrenal glands that are coming out of the cattle. So they're actually taking the adrenal glands out, right, off the kidneys, and they're drying them up and grinding them up, and it's essentially what the raw material is. And the thought process is very simply is that like organs in like organisms support similar function. So when we take an adrenal concentrate, your body is able to use the components that come from that adrenal concentrate to support the adrenal glands within your own system.
Love it. Love it. So for the listeners, I know this is a lot, but if you feel like you may have some adrenal fatigue, adrenal issues, right? We do have a product that's called Herbal Adrenal Complex. It just has the herb. So if you're listening and you're like, I don't know if I need the calming aspect or if I need the adrenal, cortex extract to boost cortisol, the safest bet is to just take plain herbs, right? But if you know, I am wired, I cannot sleep, I am anxious, I need to be calmed down, then we have the Calming Adrenal Calm. If you need to be more driven because you're just wiped and tired, we call that product Adrenal Drive for a reason, because that has the licorice in it and the adrenal gland concentrate, basically, right, to stimulate cortisol. So what I like to do in my patients is test salivary cortisol levels and obviously talk about lifestyle modifications that need to happen, right? But then put them on supportive products and then eventually retest, and we do see a lot of improvement. So adrenals obviously play a huge role in energy. Now, I can't not ask you about immune support. I mean, we have to go there.
Sure.
We have to go to immune support.
Great product. Yeah.
I was just saying, like, I want to talk about immune support in general, but our product is literally called immune support that can help support the immune system.
Both of them. Yeah.
So I want to talk about the ingredients, that are included in there. So can you talk about why those ingredients are so important? And then I do want to talk about serum-derived immunoglobulins, because I've only mentioned those a few times on the show, but let's just talk about, obviously today I'm a little run down because I had a lot of stress, right? I'm going to take some immune support today. That's how I messed up, because I had already taken my prenatal, and then I had a mitochondrial complex on my desk, and I grabbed an immune support and that, and I took all kinds of things this morning. So tell us why why this product was created. I absolutely love it. What the benefits of the agents included are.
So obviously, in the last couple of years, there was a big virus that's going around, right, and still is, right? But we kind of sat back, not just as a company, but as an industry, and as practitioners and providers. I'm obviously not one, but a lot of practitioners and providers sat back and they said, okay, what are we doing, right? What are we doing for immune support? How can we help build up? This is a prime example of metabolic reserves. Making sure how much micronutrient, how many micronutrients, do we have in our gas tank? So if or when we come in contact with some sort of viral pathogen or some sort of physiological challenge, how much do we have available that our body can go find and use when it needs to use them, right? So the raw materials in immune support that you're referencing are things like vitamin C, zinc, vitamin D, and acetylcysteine and quercetin, right? Which a lot of patients are probably listening to and saying, yeah, recognize a lot of those things, especially as we come out of the COVID years, for immune support, immune function, right? And the reason is because those are all micronutrients. Those are all things that the body, again, goes to look for when we get sick, when we end up with a viral pathogen. I'm not talking about COVID, I'm talking about anything, right, that stresses our system. But when we encounter some sort of viral pathogen, when we get sick, that's what our body goes to look for. It goes to look for those micronutrients, goes to look for those things so it can use them to help fight off some sort of pathogen. That's the ultimate goal. Right. Sure. So that's why we formulated that product from a conceptual standpoint. And obviously those are all geared towards immune support, immune function.
Talk a little bit about quercetin and zinc and the relationship there.
Yeah. So quercetin, in addition to just being a fantastic raw material that has different pleiotropic effects, it actually does quite a few different things around the body. Zinc disrupts a lot of different points that viruses are actually able to attach and translate and make their viral, basically messenger components. They're actual, not DNA, right, but virus version. It's escaping me right now. But what the viruses are doing is they attach to a host cell, they spit their genetic information inside, they use the host cell to basically replicate and make more versions of the virus and then spit that back out, right? Zinc is able to actually disrupt, from a micronutrient perspective at the biochemical level, is actually able to disrupt multiple different points on that process. Right. The problem is for whatever reason, our cells don't like zinc as much as they should. Right. So what quercetin does is it actually acts in a way as a natural zinc ionophore. And what that means is, because I know it's another big word, what that means is it helps basically bring zinc into cells. Quercetin will grab zinc's hand, shuttle it into cells so it can actually say, hey, I'm here, virus, you're not. right? We're going to get you out of there. So zinc disrupts the actual attachment. It disrupts translation, replication. It disrupts the entire process those cells would use, those virus cells, to use to create more viruses.
Love it, love it. And N-acetylcysteine, you already mentioned previously as being an ingredient in mitochondrial complex, as it can help boost glutathione, right? Help the mitochondria. But in this product, it has another role. What's its role in this product?
Yeah, so it's basically, I mean, again, it's another one that has pleiotropic effects, right? So it does a few different things. In addition to, if you just get mucousy, it's going to break up disulfide bonds, lower the viscosity of the mucus, right? But N-acetylcysteine is also an essential precursor to glutathione, which is going to help with our immune system. As our immune system is being taxed, it's going to create oxidative stress. That's just what's going to happen, right? So we need glutathione stores in order for our body to reduce the oxidative stress capacity so our body can function more normally, especially when we're getting challenged with a viral load.
Awesome, awesome. Okay, I'm going to put you on the spot, and I hope you don't mind. I can edit this out if you disagree. But recently in a staff meeting, you shared that you did contract not the popular virus here, but a different virus that impacted your GI system
I did.
quite aggressively.
Yeah.
And there was one product that you really do feel significantly helped reduce the severity and then the duration of that illness. And that was the serum-derived immunoglobulins. So these are part of our gut healing protocol. They're part of our yeast bacteria cleanse. We use these a lot. And the term that we kind of talked about during that staff meeting was that SBIGG really works as an immunologic binder. So I want the listeners to really take that home. This is an immunologic binder. So explain what you mean, what we mean when we say immunologic binder and how it helped you.
Yeah, what does that mean, right? So you're absolutely right. I did contract a pretty nasty, what we're assuming was virus. I was out actually at the Ortho sales meeting in February, and a few of us, about a dozen of us, got taken down. It wasn't fun. But we all were, obviously we had some availability to get some of what you were talking about.
Thankfully, yeah.
That was brought to my door. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Kellen, if you guys are listening, for bringing me those products. But basically what we're talking about is immunological binders. And immunological binders, simply put, is a component that's able to track or travel through our GI lumen, so actually inside the GI tract, and bind to essentially anything that is going to trigger an immune response. Right? Because the reason we're doing this is, I'm sure a lot of patients have heard, a lot of practitioners know this, is that most of our immune system is housed in our gut. I know that's kind of a loaded statement in and of itself, but what I mean by that is a lot of cells exist in our gut that are sitting and waiting to read signals from the outside world, right? Because if you think about it, and this is kind of gross to think about, but if you think about it, we have basically one opening and one exit, right? One entrance and one exit, and everything that travels through that system, our body needs to process, not just from a micronutrient standpoint, not just from a digestion standpoint, but a lot of the stuff we eat probably has pathogens, bad bacteria, a lot of stuff that's coming through our system that we need to manage, right? We hear all the time, people get sick from salmonella, get sick from E. coli from eating food. They're there. There's organisms that are there, right? So these organisms that come through, we have what are called antigen presenting cells sitting in our GI tract. And these are cells like dendritic cells, macrophages, basically any part of our immune system that's sitting and waiting to grab onto any of these components that are traveling through. And when they're doing is they're sitting and they're waiting, and one of these, let's say gram-negative bacteria come through, they die, they break open, I call it dumping your junk, but they dump their junk into our GI lumen, dendritic cell grabs it and says, okay, now we need to have an immune response. We need to mount an immune response. LPS is a big one, like lipopolysaccharide, or some of these other cell wall components or anything that comes out of these bacteria, your body is going to recognize and have an immune response. And when we have that immune response in the gut, this increases inflammation, increases further immune responses, right? Our GI tract is linked to a whole host of chronic disease states, right? As we talk about its relationship to other organ systems. So what we're doing with SBIGG, or these serum-derived bovine immunoglobulins, is we're sending them through the gut lumen to bind up to these components as our body is killing off these bacteria as they're dying naturally, bind to these components so they can't interact with our immune system.
Which is amazing, and that's exactly what we want.
Absolutely.
Which makes SBIGG extremely important when we think of autoimmune diseases as well, right? We want to lessen any trigger for the immune system. And by we want to get rid of any of these bad, we'll just say organisms, particles, whatnot, so that our immune system can do what it needs to do, right? Fight off whatever the priority is. So all in all, I keep saying for general immune support, not referencing the product immune support.
Sure.
Would you say top supplements you would recommend are the vitamin D, vitamin C, zinc, quercetin, and N-acetylcysteine, which are in the product immune support, SBIGG, and then something like mitochondrial complex, or would you add to that?
Absolutely. I think that that's a great place to start. If patients are concerned about their immune function, that's where I would start. You could start by pairing the product immune support for immune support with mitochondrial complex. Mitochondrial complex actually, and you talked about this with Tom Poole, and that's again another great episode to go listen to. That product, that specific micronutrient formulation, has actually been the subject of a research study on patients who have HIV and AIDS. And what they're looking at is the reconstitution of CD4 and CD8 cell counts, so actual immune cells available to the body. And what we found is that over the course of 12 weeks, patients who are taking that specific micronutrient formula with the antioxidants, the micronutrient capacity, and everything that's found in between, and acetylcysteine, acetylcarnitine, alpha-lipoic acid, is that you see about a 24% increase compared to placebo, right? So if patients are taking that product daily as their multivitamin, that is a product that's going to help reconstitute and prepare their immune systems for different challenges. Not only from, again, a micronutrient standpoint, so talking about metabolic reserves, but actually talking about the ability of the body to create more immune cells. When we have more energy, we create more immune cells, right? Because what does every organ system in our body draw energy from? It's our ATP, it's our mitochondria, right? So when they're healthy and they're functioning at high capacity, the body has energy to do other things, right? Then SBIGG, reducing immune system but reducing immune system overactivation. We don't want to reduce our function, right? But reducing immune system overactivation in the gut is paramount, right? Because if we think about it, these immune cells are just sitting there and they're waiting. And when we activate these immune cells, it taxes all of our systems. They have to devote that energy that we talked about from our metabolic reserves to devote it to and some sort of immunological response. That requires energy. That requires micronutrients. That is a taxing thing on the body. It increases inflammation, right? It leads to a system where now we're increasing our intestinal permeability. So now we're getting different things into our system that may absorb that we don't want them to, in different amounts that we don't want them to. Talking about medication, other toxins, environmental toxins, a lot of different things that shouldn't end up inside of our system or shouldn't interact with our system under normal circumstances, right? And then after that, of course, immune support the product, have to, right? Because if you ask me what are your, top 5 micronutrients that you would recommend, it would be those 5. Very intelligently so, we put them all in one product for a very cost-effective solution that is meant to be taken every day.
I'm glad you said that. It is very cost-effective because when the pandemic started, patients were coming to our office wanting all these ingredients and they're buying them all separately. And this just cuts the cost dramatically.
All under one roof. Yeah.
Plus it's formulated to be safe for those who are pregnant and nursing, which is amazing. So love that. You've been a wealth of knowledge. This was awesome. I get to divide this into 2 episodes today, but before we wrap up the show, you want to tell listeners where they can find you, any last just tips for the listeners, and then I'll ask you your top longevity tip.
Absolutely. Yeah. So if you want to find me, I live in Iowa. I'm just kidding. But, if any practitioners want to reach out, obviously I'm on LinkedIn. We can obviously put that in the bio, or I'll send you a link for that. Sure. You can go on orthomolecularproducts.com and take a look at our products and actually see what we have to offer. There's 170, this may be incorrect because we just came with a couple more, 174, I believe, different products that we actually formulate and manufacture. So there's a wide range of different products for different patient types, which is awesome. Love that, right?
All of which you can only get through a licensed clinician's office, like our office. You're not going to find any of these on Amazon or anywhere else. This is the professional channel that we kind of open the episodes talking about.
Correct. Yeah. So sorry, patients, unfortunately, we can't purchase products direct on the website, but, connect with a practitioner like Dr. Gray, who's a wealth of knowledge and is trained in and well-versed in this type of, functional integrative medicine. That's a great place to start. If we're not local or can't connect via telemedicine, that's a great place to start.
Awesome. Thank you. Top longevity tip. You've given us so many tips today, but one, you got to narrow it down. What's your top longevity tip?
My top longevity tip would be to address your micronutrient deficiencies. Would be to make sure that we are giving our body its best ability to fill up, stop calling it metabolic reserves, because I know I said that a bunch, fill up the gas tank. Make sure that as we age, as we become physiologically stressed, mentally stressed, emotionally stressed, cardiometabolically stressed, whatever it may be, as we age and approach chronic disease, which, let's be honest, most of us are going to challenge or have challenges with through the course of our life. If you don't, congratulations, good for you. But most of us are going to have a challenge where we experience chronic disease. Your body's going to look for those micronutrients. So by taking high quality products that increase our metabolic reserves, fill up our gas tank, you're going to give your body its best fighting chance as we age. Absolutely.
Wonderful. Perfect. Well said. Well, thank you so much today for coming on the show, bearing with me. Now you got to go take some adrenal support, calm you down. Our adrenaline's been high, our cortisol's high. Now we need to calm down and rest
Gotta
after
go find
this.
some L-theanine. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, again, thanks for coming on the show and sharing how important nutrients are for our body, for overall health, for our immune system, for energy, and ultimately for longevity. This was awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gray.